Welcome to the Superintendent's Budget Advisory Task Force meeting for May 17th. And as we traditionally do, we'll start with just a quick review of our norms. If everybody has the agenda, looks like some of you are logged on. Starting on time, focusing on the problem, not the person, use of discretion, one person can speak at a time, assume all have the best of intentions, and the agenda created by representatives of the task force with input from other groups. Keep an open mind, pre-reads. Everybody at the table are equals, respect other suggestions, and understand and think through with no emotion. As a trustee, listen, take a step back, assess current processes, and hear new ideas generated from the group. And to review our purpose and goals, the task force goals: develop an understanding of the district's budget and financial issues, recommend to the Board of Education through the superintendent ideas related to reducing expenditures or increasing revenues towards a more balanced and focused budget, contribute to improved communication, to enhance understanding of the district's budget and financial condition, and contribute to and support a transparent and collaborative budget process. So I think we've got everybody admitted to the meeting so far that's joining us. As we have covered those two things as introductions, as many of you have already called out, it's my pleasure to welcome back Mr. Parangao to Fremont Unified School District as our interim associate superintendent. And I'm sure you'll all join me in offering our thanks that he's back to support us for the next few months. And he's going to take over most of the show today. I don't want to steal any of the thunder, but certainly the most interesting May revise I've seen in a while, in part because it's coming off of, not off of the heels, but certainly it seems to be coming off a different trajectory of our pandemic, and certainly a huge surplus compared to what we were facing last year in the state's budget. And the first time that I can recall in a long time, it looks to be a proposal to change some of the aspects of the local control funding formula. And as we get more details about that, that'll be something we certainly want to take a look at, because as we know, the local control funding formula does not impact all districts equally. So we'll be wanting to keep a keen eye on what these proposals mean for Fremont Unified. And as a reminder, this is a review of the May revise, which we normally have the workshop that we attend before we start going through some of these things. And just based on the timing, that workshop takes place on Thursday, the 20th. So we'll be going through the information that we have so far. Mr. Parangao, would you like to take it away from here?
Sure, yes. Hey, good afternoon, everyone. So as PJ already mentioned, that this is the actual workshop will happen on Thursday. But fortunately, we got some preliminary information coming from School Services of California. And what I did was I included them in the agenda. I put a link on it, the overview of that, so that you could follow along, or you could read them at your own time. And so what we did was we put them together in a very short PowerPoint presentation, which I'm going to present this afternoon. I also linked a copy of the presentation, which, by the way, would be the same one that would be presented at the board meeting on Wednesday. And so at this point, I'm going to be sharing my screen for the PowerPoint. And if I can find it. I believe this is the one. So are you seeing the presentation?
Yeah, we can see the presentation.
Okay, so I want to start with the state budget cycle, just to give us an understanding of the timing. So January is when we hear the budget proposal from the governor. Normally it's about the first or second week of January when we hear them. And the reason
Raul,
why
I'm not, sorry to interrupt you, but I'm not sure if it's just my screen, but what happened is the image turned into one very narrow line across the screen. Has anybody else seen that, or is it just me?
Yeah, Raul, you have multiple screens set up and you have your presentation slid over onto another monitor. You need to slide it back onto the one you're sharing.
Okay, so let me try to do that. There's so many screens open right here. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna close all my screens, and so that's the only one on the screen. Okay, so let's try it one more time. Are you seeing them now?
We're still seeing the same same thing.
I would recommend stop sharing and then reshare your screen. Oh.
Stop sharing and let's try again. Okay.
We had it earlier when you had it more in the center of your desktop. I think if you bring it back and hit play slideshow, that might do it. I may be also to pull it up for you on my computer and share it if that helps.
That probably would be better. And then we could just,
Okay.
if you could drive it, I'd appreciate it.
CJ and Rahul, I also have that open if you want me to share. Oh, you got it. Okay.
I think it looks better now. Okay, so if you could move it to the next slide, please. Yeah, so I'd like to start with the state budget cycle. And I think the importance of this is just to be able for us to see when things happen. And so towards the second week of January, that's when the governor generally announced the state budget proposal. And I'd like to highlight the word proposal just because until it is signed, it is a proposal. While this is the basis in which we develop our budget, it is a proposal. And a lot of times, the proposal that the governor makes in January and when it's revised in May, by the time it gets signed, sometimes there are changes. And so, and it also gives us the opportunity to advocate for a particular program or any dollar amount that the governor puts. So that's January. So in May, that's when the governor makes revisions to the proposed budget that he announced in January, which is commonly known as the May revise. And so by June 15, that's when the deadline, as far as the legislature needs to pass the budget. And I put Proposition 25 on it. This was approved by the voters many years ago, and simply saying that the budget has to be passed by June 15. Otherwise, if it is not passed, the legislators don't get paid. And so there's an incentive for the legislators to do that. And then after that, no later than June 30th, the governor enact or sign the budget, and so that becomes our final state budget for the next year. Now, as you may be aware, from the last governor and this governor, it's always been signed on time, but previous to that, there were times when it got delayed and it signed in August. And so, just want to make sure that that we are aware of that. Hopefully by this June 30th, the governor will be able to find the budget on time. Next slide, please. So, can we go back to the previous slide? I just want to cover the chart that is next to it. So the state budgets are generally made up of two big pots. One is Proposition 98, which is roughly about 38% of the general fund budget, and about 62% are all the other state programs, which include health and human services, transportation, and all the other services of the state. So for today, we're going to be focusing mainly on the Proposition 98, which is roughly about 38% of the state general fund budget. Next slide. So on Proposition 98, this is the historical view of the Prop 98. You will see that there are different colors towards the end of the chart. And the blue is the historical information. And for 2021, you notice an $82.8 billion that was proposed by the governor in January. But then in May, when he made the proposal, that amount has grown from 82.8 to 92.8. And for 21-22, it was originally proposed in January at 85.8, but now it is, you can see it from the screen, what is that number? $93.7 billion. Now, in 2019-20, you will wonder why is there a change in 19-20? Well, the state could actually still make changes to the Proposition 98, even if the year is already closed, and that is allowed by the state. So originally in January, it was calculated at $79.5 billion, but now it's about $79.3 billion. So just want to show you the changes that happened between January and May. Next slide, please. So on Proposition 98, Prop 98 is the minimum funding guarantee for CK14. So just want to, I highlighted the word minimum because a lot of times, we were wondering why California is probably number 47 out of the nation in terms of the funding. It's because education is being funded at the minimum. So there is really no maximum if you are funded on the floor. Besides, Prop 98 also includes grades 13 and 14, which is the community colleges. And so when we hear Prop 98, it covers. I also highlighted minimum because I think there is an opportunity right there. For decades, we have been funded at the minimum level, but there is nothing precludes from the state to fund us beyond the minimum. And so it would be an opportunity for us when we speak to our legislators that, hey, there's nothing that precludes you from funding us, 45%, 43% from the state general fund budget. I just know that in the last many decades, it has been funded at the minimum. In some cases, the state even manipulated that, and we were funded below the minimum. And that was from the previous two governors. Local property taxes fund Proposition 98. This one is rather important because some of our citizens are asking, how is our property taxes affect the education funding? And so what happened is the property taxes, which actually help fund property taxes. I'd like to describe this and maybe just give an example to give an understanding to this. So let's just say Proposition 98 is identified to be $100. And let's say the property tax collected from local government, let's say, is $35. The state needs to come up with $65 to be able to fully fund Proposition 98. So why is that important? It's because when the property value is changing, especially nowadays when houses in California are very expensive, and then there is the buying and selling, the property value gets reevaluated and the property taxes grow. And so when the property tax grow, let's say that the tax collection instead of 35 now becomes $45. Well, guess what? The state will only provide $55 to be able to make 100. And so in many ways, when the property value goes up, it helps the state funding because they only need to come up with a smaller amount. Now, for a district like us, it doesn't really grow when the property tax goes. It doesn't really grow the amount of money that we're getting. There is approximately about 10% of the district in the state who benefit from the growth in property taxes, and those are what we call the basically districts. That would be for a different discussion, but I just would like to point out that when our community asks how is my property taxes help in the funding education, it is helping, but it's not really helping the district as much as helping the state in managing their own budget. Due to the surplus, which I'm sure you've probably heard that there is a big surplus of the state $75.7 billion budget surplus. GAM limit has been triggered. And just so you know what GAM limit is, this is actually the allowable limit to grow the expenditures, the government expenditures from year to year. And so because of the surplus, it has triggered that. And when it gets triggered, the amount over the limit must be split evenly between education and taxpayer refund. And so it's been identified that the estimated over the limit about $16.2 billion, of which $8.1 billion will go towards Golden State Seniors. So California will be providing some type of money to the taxpayers, and about $8.1 billion towards 22-23 Prop 90. So we won't be able to see the benefit of that quite yet. It will be at the next budget. So how is Proposition 98 distributed to school districts? So the largest portion of Prop 98 when it gets to us is through the LCFS. And I highlighted it under restricted funds. It also comes to us in the form of state categorical programs, which are generally restricted funds. And then there are one-time funding, which are generally restricted. Sometimes it contains unrestricted general funds. Well, this slide is quite important because when you receive a state categorical program, normally those dollars are earmarked dollars. You can only use them for a specific purpose. The problem with, and I will take every dollar that the state will provide us in categorical programs, but there's a challenge there. The challenge is sometimes when they provide categorical money, it doesn't necessarily align to the district, or sometimes it is insufficient to truly address the needs of the district. It would be better if the state will provide the funding in the form of unrestricted general fund or LCFS. And that's why in the past we probably heard them say, how about if we increase the state, the base funding for LCFS? That way it provides more control. We are able to align the money with the needs, the specific needs of the district. And so instead of providing state categorical programs. So just like I said, any dollar that comes from the state, we will take it, but it would be better if they give it to us without a lot of restrictions. Next slide, please. So in terms of cost of living adjustment, so now that we discussed how they are distributed, so this is actually one of the areas how the state provides for the Prop 59A in the form of cost of living adjustment. And so in January, the governor announced that the COLA would be 3.84%. And the makeup of that was 2.31% statutory COLA in 2021. As we know that in 2021 we said 0, but the statutory COLA in 2021 was 2.31%. Well, the governor is making that up and saying, here is 2.31 for you, but let's add to that a statutory COLA for 21-22. This one passed. That makes it 3.84%. When you do the math, it's not going to quite add up because there is a compounding effect of the one we have to. Well, in May, the governor said, so give me the 2.31, but the statutory COLA for 21-22 now is higher to 1.7%. And he's also proposing to add additional 1% to address ongoing fiscal pressures for school districts. And again, now it's 5.07%. That includes the compounding effect of the two additional layers. So now we have the 384 to 5.07, and this is referred to many times by some of our friends in Sacramento called super COLA, because I've never seen COLA this high. So there's a reason why it's called the super COLA. Special education, however, is getting a different rate, so it's categorical program. So here, special education is at 4.05% COLA in categorical program 1.7%. I just would like to mention that special education, since the number is larger than what we heard in January, I also would like to mention, and many of you already noticed, the special education is still operating in a deficit. So we have a large deficit for special ed, and hopefully the government, also state Sacramento, will prioritize that in terms of funding, because that's an area where we are still spending more than what we do. Next slide. So what's in the budget proposal? There is disproportionate deferral of $10.3 billion. This one right here is a large amount of money, but this is not reconcile the accounting mechanism. State of California uses a different methods of counting compared to the school district. They use a cash basis, and school district uses accrual basis. And the difference between the two is that when the state does not recognize expenditure until they release the money. So the recognition of expenditure only happens when they write the check and send to the school district, whereas the school district is recognizing the revenue when it's earned. And so the $10.3 billion is a way for the state in terms of cash remittance. So this actually helps us, and the benefit for the district on the apportionment deferral is to manage our cash flow, because what it means that we're going to be receiving apportionment on time. So if you can imagine Robbie waiting for those money to come in on a monthly basis, and if they don't come, the accounting department has to juggle to find out how to be able to pay all our bills. And so what this does is it will send the money on time, so it should be on a monthly basis. And there will also be some additional funding for special education. This one-time funding for $201 million. There is about $3.3 billion multi-year funding for educator workforce, and I lined up right here the details of all of that and how much money is involved. And so there is a teacher reference program for $550 million. There's also some funding for classified credentialing program for $100 million. So, and so on. So let's move to the next slide, please. This is probably one of the biggest proposals for early childhood education, transitional kindergarten expansion for $2.7 billion. So simply what it is that to offer transitional kindergarten to all 4-year-olds. It used to be that there is a cutoff in terms of who could go to transitional kindergarten. Now it would be all 4-year-olds. Reduced TK class size by 24-25 is about $740 million. And I think this one right here is to keep the same number of students in one classroom, but adding one adult in the classroom so that the average class size will be smaller. There is $250 million for TK facilities. There is $2.6 billion for intensive tutoring for students, and I think this one is co-funded by the federal funds also. There is a $2 billion for school reopening, and it's a one-time fund to provide for more testing and for vaccination clinics in sites. There is $1 billion for after-school and summer programs, and this could be increasing by up to $5 billion in 25-26. And then children and youth behavioral health initiative, $4 billion for years of 5 years. So the last item I did for $4 billion, it's not $4 billion for each year, but it's $4 billion, total $4 billion for the entire 5 years. Next slide, please. There is, the governor also proposed 100,000 new subsidized childcare slots. We weren't able to pinpoint exactly how much dollar he's putting on it. I'm sure it's going to cost some money, but we weren't able to find it out at this time. There's also 6,500 new childcare slots funded by Proposition 64. Next slide. So what is not in the budget proposal? So there is no new funding for increased pension contributions. So you may have heard that FCRS will increase by 1% from last year to this year, to the next budget year, to 16.92%, and PERS will decrease by 0.09%. I also would like to mention that back in before 2014-15, the FCRS rate went up from 8.25% to now 16.22. There's also a corresponding increase to the teachers. I think it was from 8% to 10 point, a little over 10 to 10.5. There's no augmentation for the increase in unemployment insurance rate. Unemployment insurance rate is going up from 0.05 to 1.23%. This represents 2,300% increase. Just to put that in perspective, when I calculated that for the entire district, it's about $4.1 million in additional expenditure for 2021-22. There's no funding for the supplemental payment of Proposition 98. It has been eliminated, and what that is that in the budget act for 2021, it included 0.5% annual payment towards Prop 98 until it's 40%. Right now, it's roughly about 38%. But the governor, when he signed the budget, there was a 0.5% annual payment, but now that is supposed to be eliminated. So what's next? In the preliminary budget and the LCAP public hearing will take place on June 2nd. We will be submitting to the board the proposed budget and LCAP adoption on June 3rd. And the governor is expected to sign the state budget by June 30th. District staff will attend the workshop, school services workshop in July, and then we will be making any changes to the adopted budget within 45 days after the governor. So that concludes my presentation. I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you so much. If people in the call want to just raise their hand, and then we'll move through to the questions. And as people are thinking of their questions, I will just remind everybody that this is the governor's proposal. And as Raul pointed out, we'll see what sticks and what gets changed. But I would expect a lot of it to hold, but we'll see what some of those final details are as we move forward. Trustee Jones.
Yeah, thank you. There's no doubt that the news about the COLA is good. I want to make sure I understood, Raul, with the unemployment insurance. Did I hear you correctly? Are we thinking that's a $4.1 million expense for FUSD? That
Yeah.
Okay.
As soon as I seen the article, I run the calculation to determine the impact district for us, for the entire district. And yes, I determined it's $4.1 million. And, you know, I think this is really important because a lot of times when we hear the governor making a proposal, we think about how much money we're going to receive. But sometimes we forget to talk about what are the additional unfunded mandates that is being imposed. And I think this is very important for us to share both sides of the story. And so in this case, SCRS is going to go up by 1%, and unemployment insurance is going to go up by 2,360%.
Okay. And are there any, with the TK facilities money that's coming, is that something that we need to apply for? Is that like a grant that we would need to apply for, or is that just going to come to us?
Still unclear at this time how that would be distributed to the district. My wild guess is that if this is a mandate, that this will be an automatic grant for each and every district because it's a mandate. Now, if it is an option for you to implement, then you have to apply for it. So it depends on how the governor is going to be, or how the signed budget will be, if the PK expansion will be a mandate or an option.
Okay.
So facilities will be determined.
Okay, and one last question for now. When we talk about, did I lose my question? Did it come out of my head? I think it came out of my head. I'll come back when it pops back into my head.
No problem. Thank you, Trustee Jones. Victoria.
Thank you, CJ, and thank you, Raul, for the presentation. I'll pick up where Trustee Jones just left off on TK, because we've had a slight decline in enrollment for the last couple years, but I do believe, and I wanted to verify, that we are budgeting for the ADA that we had for this year, which was actually higher than we had last year because our percentage was so much greater. The district really did a great job digitally of getting the attendance in and tracking. And so it had noted that hold harmless would actually allow us to use this year's. So I'm wondering if that means we'll actually see budgetarily an increase in enrollment for next year. And then secondly, do we get to retro that, and do we get to get our budget for this year's ADA for this year when we previously had been working off of funds from, I think, P2 of the previous year? So that's my two-part on ADA. And then on TK, still on, well, we have some classrooms open because we had those declines in enrollment. Could we start to use TK classrooms and capture perhaps additional funding, even if it's out in front of what the governor's proposal is, so that we can get some bodies in classrooms, since we are already outfitted with the TK program? And then thirdly, going younger than TK, childcare was noted, but I think preschool was also in there. And is that something, since we do preschool as well, could we do preschool, or are the facilities too different that it would be a decision really for the school board to decide to outfit our facilities to decide to do more preschool.
I think you're going to need to help me out to recap all your 3 questions. I think if I understand correctly, your first question was, which ADA do we use in calculating our LCSS? Is that kind of like your question? Okay. So by law, if we are a declining enrollment and declining ADA, we use the prior year, the higher of the prior year, or the higher for the current year. So just because we decline our enrollment doesn't necessarily mean that our ADA would be low. Your ADA, your enrollment would decline a little bit, but if we are efficient, if the student shows up every single day, we may hit 97, 98% in our attendance rate, and therefore ADA will go up. Bottom line is, whichever is higher between the prior and the current, that's what we use. So I think that is a good protection for us. However, I think there is still, and this is not yet decided, and I have not seen any documentation that this is allowed. The highest point of ADA we had was February 2020, I believe. That was the prior to COVID-19. There has been a lot of effort for us to be able to use that number. And that has not, I have not seen this in the May revised, but maybe we will be able to find it out down the road. So if we are allowed to use that, then that would be even more beneficial for the did I answer that question, Victoria? The very first one before I move to the next?
I thought that I've seen the presentations because the superintendent did a great job in the fall of this year through the beginning presentations. And I know, Raul, we have such high expectations of you that somehow you'll have reviewed all of these, these documents. So thank you so much. That we actually have had our ADA increase despite an enrollment decline, and that is during the course of the 2021 school year. So my question is, do we have that documented for one of our quarters that would be the ADA number we can be working off of, and what would then the estimated increase be for our funding?
Raul and Victoria, if I may, I'll have to go back and double check, because I think, Victoria, I remember what you were talking about, and I think it was part of the governor's. Well, we had a couple of things in the fall. You know, when we were first reporting out our ADA, our enrollment, our participation, it was higher than our in-person days. But if I remember correctly, in the governor's proposal in January, I think we were still allowed to use the highest of the last 2 years, but I think it was still reverting back to the P2 of last school year. And so I'm not sure if we're afforded the opportunity to use our distance learning ADA numbers or not. I'd have to go back and really look at the budget and find out, because if I understand what you're saying is, if our ADA numbers were higher in distance learning, that could just by definition give us an increase in revenue in that sense. I think the proposal was from the governor that we would have to stick with the P2 of last spring, and then we could still use the higher of the last 2 years. But we will certainly go back and find out. And as a side note, I think, you know, one of the things we talked about at that time is we want to be mindful of the pros and cons of that, right? The additional revenue certainly would be really helpful. But at some point, if we're still experiencing a decline, and maybe that's offset a little bit with some changes in TK, would we be building a larger cliff between the highest of our last 2 years and then ultimately when that catches up with us? But we can certainly dig into if we're allowed to use the higher ADA from the fall in P1 or P2.
So CJ, may I clarify something?
Absolutely.
We did not report P2 or P1 this year. 2021, we did not prepare or report our ADA reports, which become the basis for our LCFF calculation. So either we have to rely on 1920 P2 ADA, or when the actual ADA for 21-22 becomes available, because we do not have 2021 available. That has not been reported by any school district because we had exemption during 2021 fiscal year or school year.
Thank
So
you. So I
the
think
law,
that's why we had to go back to the P2 as the last submitted official record.
so the ed code has to be actually modified and clarify this thing. And to this point, I'm not sure that they have made any changes to ed code that defines current year or previous year ADA, whichever is higher.
And I think you mentioned about the P2 EDA from 2019-20, that the cutoff was even changed. It was February of 2020, which was prior to the COVID-19. So I think that would be the highest point, because as soon as the COVID hit, there were some absences, and that's why I think the state allowed for so earlier. Generally, it's about 3-4-15 and we cut them off. To your next question about the facilities question, your question is, can we use the existing facilities, existing classrooms, since we have declining enrollment, can we use them to start expanding PK? Is that the correct question? So I think the reason why that is a little bit challenging, I'm not saying no, but it's challenging is because there are special requirements in terms of the classroom that you could use for PK. You must have a restroom inside the classroom in order for you to be able to hold a PK. And if not, I believe there is a specific requirements for you to have a restroom that is closest to the classroom for a PK class. And so, depending on the availability of it, just because there are maybe additional available classrooms in the school, but if it doesn't have a restroom, you cannot just simply use them for a PK class without making some type of retrofit benefit. So that is and that's the reason why the governor is providing some funding for facilities, just to allow for something like that. Now, when I look at the dollar amount, it's not a lot of money, and you and I know that just looking at one classroom and putting plumbing and the restroom in it, that could cost potentially a lot of money. And I'm afraid that the amount that is set aside for facilities is probably not going to be enough by the time everybody wants to retrofit their time.
So it might only make sense if a kinder, for example, like if there were 3 kinders at one site and there might be an AM slot open in an existing classroom. So we would have to be selective. Otherwise, you're saying it's likely that even the incentive money, we would still be going into our own pocket to offset the true cost of expansion. Then maybe that's similar on my pre-K question, because I imagine if TK has additional facilities, then pre-K is probably a similar answer.
Yes, and as a matter of fact, the requirements for preschoolers is much more stricter than a PK. Not only that you have the same, maybe a similar requirement, you have to have additional requirements with the fire department and the health department because of the additional precautionary measures like fire alarms and other precautionary measures for the early childhood education. So, like for example, we have some facilities, let's say at Blaco for preschool. Those actually goes into a much different licensing as compared to a typical kindergarten or conditional kindergarten.
Thank you. The next hand I see is Trustee Jones.
Oh, you're on mute.
Sorry. I remember my question, but really quickly, I wanted to follow up with something Victoria said, because not only are we seeing this, TK expansion, but the governor has talked about full day kinder at some point. And I think we have to start preparing for that, which is another facilities thing that we're going to have to look at, because if we currently have 2 kindergarten classes sharing a room, if we have to go to full day and outfit enough classrooms to accommodate full day kindergarten and expanded TK, we're looking at a real impact to our facilities. And I want to start planning for that sooner rather than later. I don't want to be caught off guard, at the, the year before we have to implement it with not having outfitted those facilities with the restrooms we need. So back to my question. It's great because whatever the increased COLA is, we're guaranteed to get that. I'm wondering, with all the other infusions of money that we're seeing from the governor, how many of those infusions will reach Fremont? And specifically, I know sometimes those extra dollars get targeted to Title I, they get targeted to districts that have concentration grants or high supplemental grants, and sometimes those big infusions of money that we see from the governor at the state level don't actually come to Fremont. And I'm wondering if we have any sense of how many of those dollars are targeted to districts that wouldn't include us.
Well, at this point, we are still unclear, and even when the school services hold their workshop, they're also doing the same thing like we do. We're trying to get all the details, and until such time that the Department of Finance provides us some details in terms of how those are distributed and what formula is going to be used, it's really hard to determine how much of that money will be for us. One of the things that I've done as I combed through the summary from school services to determine what type of funding would likely fit our district, whether it be a small amount or a large amount. You will notice when you do the comparison that there are things that I did not even include in the presentation because I know for a fact that we'll get is zero. And so I didn't even put it in the presentation. And so for the ones that you see on the slide, those are more likely we're going to get. We just don't know how much because we don't know what the formula are yet. And so, I recall when I was at the County Office of Education, this is a big struggle for us because we always would like to provide the latest for the school district. And this is the things that we talk with the Department of Finance a lot of times and say, give us the formula so that we can help us. And a lot of times we're not getting them on time. The unfortunate part is that sometimes when we get them in July and we get them in August, sometimes it's a little too late for us because it takes some time to plan for a particular program. And by the time you hit the fall, we're thinking about reopening schools and planning for new programs sometimes are a little bit challenging. So I hear what you're saying. I think sooner is better rather than later, but we're at the mercy of the Department of Finance.
Okay, and I wanted to touch back on one other thing you said about the importance of advocating with our legislators. I've been doing that, and part of the advocacy that I've been doing lately surrounds ADA and enrollment funding. And I want people to be aware of what this means and what kind of the impacts are. And I used 1920 data because that's the most current data that's available on Ed Data. And if right now folks know we're funded by ADA, so our average daily attendance, but our expenses are all tied to our enrollment numbers because we have to have enough teachers to cover all of our enrolled students. We have to have enough books to cover all of our enrolled students. So our expenses are really tied to our total enrollment, but we're only funded by ADA. And overall, Fremont has comparatively high ADA, where I think in the year I was looking at, it was around 97%, which is good. And so you think, oh, what difference does that make to us? Well, the difference between if we were funded per enrollment rather than ADA, that would have been $10 million that year. 10 million if we were funded on enrollment rather than ADA. And when we look forward, I am very concerned. I think we'll be protected next year because we'll have some kind of hold harmless. But when I look into the future about what this pandemic is going to mean for our ADA, I anticipate parents are going to be a lot more cautious about sending sick kids to school. I anticipate teachers are going to be a lot more concerned when they see sniffly nosed kids in classrooms, making sure that they send them to the office and those kids go home. So I am concerned that we are going to see a drop off in our ADA based on public health concerns. And when I calculated what just a 1% change drop in our ADA would mean, it's $3 million, or it would have been that year. So I think we need to be really thoughtful about ADA. And when I've been advocating with our legislators, I've made two requests. One is that we should flat out be funded by enrollment, not ADA, because that's how our expenses go. And if they can't manage to do that, right now, even an excused absence counts against us in terms of ADA. Is that even from a public health standpoint, if our legislators were to allow excused absences to be funded, which would allow us to be, not have policies that encourage sick kids back into the classroom, but actually keep them home. If we could be funded when a kid is sick, then even that would help us. So my dream when I talk to them is that we're funded by enrollment. If they can't manage that, I would like for them to include those excused absences toward our ADA. And not only is that just the right thing to do by funding, because even a kid with an excused absence is going to be turning in work, the teacher's going to be grading it, it generates work for our folks, which is an expense. But now it's a public health issue. We need to have schools funded in such a way so that we aren't even inadvertently passing policies that encourage sick kids to get back in seats before they're well. So that's something that I've been working on. As you can imagine, if that means a $10 million difference in Fremont, if you calculate what that would mean statewide, changing from an ADA to an enrollment funding model, that's a lot of money. And I doubt our legislators are going to get on board with that right away, but that's something that we need to start pushing for. And so I'm encouraging everybody when you talk to our legislators to make that case. And if anybody meets with a legislator and you want to invite me along to make that case for you, I'm there. Because I think it's really important, and the way we're funded right now makes no sense.
Thank you. I think you mentioned, advocacy. It's always been my advocacy and my priority to, if and when I get an opportunity to speak to legislators, to prioritize special educational. I mean, this district, and not just this district, every district in California is having the same kind of problem. And for some reason or another, we have been hearing all this additional money coming from the state, but for some reason there's only COLA for special education and some $281 million. If you look at the historical information on how much our deficit for special education year after year, raise, I don't know what the latest number is, but the last time I know it was over $30 million in deficit. That alone, if that gets fully funded, we will be $30 million richer year after year.
Thanks so much, Roland and Trustee Jones. I agree with you. The advocacy is so important, and it can be a lot of different things depending on the year. And most certainly the legislators and the governor are going to be, they're going to have a lot of advocacy at their doorstep over the next few weeks as they try and pass the budget. And there's a lot of room for conversation in terms of what different interest groups are looking for. And I've even talked with some people in Sacramento about seeing if the state can help offset some of this unemployment insurance increase because of the surplus they have, and frankly, because of some of the debacle that's happened with EDD. I don't know why, those two things combined have to fall on the shoulders of school districts. And so I think it's just always important for anybody on the call, for anybody watching the call, to recognize that there's some really important decisions that happen in Sacramento related to school funding. And some of them are direct and some of them are indirect. And so I think the more we can be a voice for our students in that conversation, the better off we are. And it's not to say that people at the state level aren't doing their very best to try and advocate for funding for students, but you heard the headlines last week that this is the record level of funding for public schools, which is true. But I don't think we're making any traction in the overall ranking across the nation of where we come in per student funding. So it's got to all be taken into context. And this is a little bit less budget driven, but I think the other thing that everybody just has to be aware of and stay in tune to is, as Rais was pointing out earlier, there's ed code that has to be modified related to attendance provisions and P1 and P2, which is how our funding is derived from the state. But when we talk about the state budget process, there's the trailer bill language that goes along with all of that. And that trailer bill language is always very significant for schools, because that is where on an annual basis, they're going in and modifying different provisions of the ed code. And as it relates to next year, it's going to be in that process where we start to see the ed code revisions or guidelines come out for what the state is going to have for independent study, for distance learning, and for those changes. And so as much as the May revise is about the fiscal implications for schools, that trailer bill process that happens as well has huge implications for school districts on how we have operational impacts as well, especially related to the pandemic. So we'll be watching the May revise. Details come to us on Thursday. And then over the next few weeks, we'll really be paying attention to what's happening in Sacramento and what it looks like they're going to settle on, because we likely will get that guidance in the middle of June when they adopt the budget. And we all know that we're already in the process of, reaching tentative agreements for our elementary virtual program and planning the best we can for next year. So we're planning ahead of what we definitively know the rule book will be, and doing the very best that we can. And that's not unique to Fremont Unified. That's every school district in the state. And it has been that way for decades. It's actually gotten a little bit easier since they changed the law to where they have to approve their budgets by mid-June. So I just wanted to put that out as a reminder, because as much as we watch this from a fiscal cycle, the trailer bill, especially as it relates to the pandemic, will have a lot of implications for schools across the state as well. Trustee Jones?
Yeah, I had one other question about ADA as it regards to distance learning or an independent study program that we're trying to set up for next school year. And I attended, along with Trustee Campbell, the CSBA Delegate Assembly this last weekend. And somebody in one of the discussions brought up that when students are on independent study, we're fully funded with ADA LCFF for that student. But there was some discussion that if you hit more than 10% of your student population enrolled in an independent study program, then it triggers something that then negatively impacts our ADA. And they were cautioning that we need to be very mindful of that and how many students end up in those programs. And I'm wondering if any of you know if that is true, or if there is going to be maybe a trailer bill language that helps us out with that for this coming year, knowing that we may have more than 10% of students wanting to be in distance learning.
Yeah, without going too deep into that scope, Trustee Jones, what you're describing is true. There's a number of provisions within Ed Code which actually stipulate what a maximum caseload should be for independent study, and it's a calculation based on your overall enrollment and a number of different factors. And so, is there a provision that could impact us if we go past a certain amount? I don't know it definitively, but I would say it most certainly sounds true, because the Ed Code is very rich in and actually has a lot of parameters about independent study rules and regulations. What I have heard from meeting with different groups, and about 2 weeks ago, I had a meeting with Assemblymember Ting and State Superintendent Thurman and 11 or 12 other representatives from the Assembly and the Senate, and about 12 or 13 other superintendents from Northern California. And what we really start to hear as a theme from that, I think was echoed in some of the governor's comments, is that it sounds like they're really going to strictly stay with independent study as the option to address students who aren't able to come back to school, but that they will give modifications to those independent study rules. I think they're, at least in conversation at this point, kind of steering away from distance learning or hybrid schedules and they want school districts to rely on their independent study programs. But I do expect that in the trailer bill, my guess is we will see independent study is the scope and the system they want us to use, but they will give us some flexibilities and freedoms within that as to not penalize us as much. So that's what I think we'll see. We'll see when they actually get to voting. But in the meeting I had, it sounded like a lot of the members of the Assembly and the Senate were really looking for schools to utilize the independent study framework. But I think there's also a lot of voice that says, how does that framework traditionally fit best for elementary versus secondary? And how do we make sure we're not penalizing school districts as well?
One of the things that I also would like, since we are on the topic of advocacy, we might as well then include pension contributions, because we, as you're aware, before 2014-15, our teachers' contribution, the employees' contribution was about 8%, and now it's about over 10%, 10.5%, if I'm not mistaken. And so there is a direct impact, negative impact to teachers' paychecks because of the increase in pension contributions. But not only that, the contribution by the employer has doubled from 8.25% to 16.2%. And I put together a very colorful chart to provide the board, just to put them in perspective, and the cost to the district is enormous. It's huge. And with a situation that we are in right now where there is a big surplus at the state, I would wish that the state would address some of those items and start funding those so that the district don't need to come up with those additional.
Thanks, Raul. Trustee Campbell.
Sorry, I had to go off mute. I just wanted to react to quickly, because I know our time is just about up, to what Trustee Jones was asking. And I actually have and started looking over the May revise. And in one of the paragraphs, it does say that there is general fund Prop 98 funds available for non-classroom based instruction, and it provides the agencies an opportunity to generate state funding by serving kids outside, and it uses the existing independent study programs specifically, and it calls out specifically additional funding for technology to be able to do that. I don't see in this proposal anywhere that if you exceed 10%, you won't be getting any funding. I just don't see that in the May revise. So I'm wondering where that came from.
It's not specifically in the May revise, but it's in existing ed code as it applies to independent study. So unless the legislature or the governor puts in a trailer bill or something that would increase that percentage, then we would still be hit with this 10% cutoff from existing ed code language as it pertains to independent study. So I'm hoping they will either, expand that percentage for the next year or give us some other kind of guidance that will allow us to accommodate as many students as who want to be in distance learning. Because I think they were preliminary, but the survey results I was seeing was we have 88% who want to go back, which that's great. But if you think about what that would mean, that just 2% difference between 90 and 88%, that could really impact our ADA. Even small percentages in a change in ADA can really significantly impact our revenue. So we want to make sure that we can accommodate all the students who want to be in distance learning or in independent study. In one of the meetings I was in, there were districts talking about how they've set up their independent study and distance learning program to be really, really unattractive, to discourage people from taking advantage of them for that reason, which is, that's not cool when we're talking about public health and a percentage of our students who won't even have access to a vaccination yet. We
Right.
need to be able to, if parents want to keep those kids home until there's a vaccine, we need to be able to accommodate all of those students and not pull shenanigans to make the program unattractive, so that we can not be hit with this 10% thing. It was, anyway, I'm hoping that they'll take care of it with the trailer bill language and we won't have to worry about it. But it's something that we probably need to advocate for.
You know, it's probably something we need to talk about too, in terms of whether there's a waiver in there for this year and next year, or over the 3-year budget period, if there's some sort of a waiver for that to allow for us to be able to have kids in distance learning if we can, as many as want to be. Raul, do you know if there's any type of waiver out there for independent study for next year?
No, not at this time. And I think this is one of those items that is rather fluid. Like I think the state is also catching up with, because there's an existing ed code, and now everybody else is feeling like, oh, everybody else might hit the threshold. Let's figure something out. And so I think, it's again based on my experience at the county level, I think these are the type of things that would be on the radar by the county to help the district. And I think as soon as we pick up some additional information, if there would be a potential waiver down the road, I think that's something that we will provide updates to this group and also to the board and the community. But at this point, no, we have not picked up anything.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Trustee Campbell. Any more questions or input from the group before we close out today's meeting? And if there aren't any more questions, this would be a time where we would also open it up for future agenda items for any input from the task force.
Are we meeting next in the fall? Are we kind of at the end here, or are we thinking another next month?
I am not ignoring you, Victoria. Sorry, I'm trying to pull up my calendar. See, when we do this next year, I'll be able to say, well, last June we did this. I still don't have that yet for last June. So I think what I'll probably do is connect with Raul, and maybe we'll look at what we might be agendizing in June. I mean, I think probably if we're going to be meeting, it's going to be a short time window, but if we were going to be meeting, maybe it's looking at what our budget looks like that we're proposing to the board. So as the task force may recall, what we will go through over the next few meetings in June is we'll bring our LCAP forward for review, and it goes through a public hearing, and then at the next June meeting it will go for approval. Our budget will go through a 2 board meeting cycle as well, and so that would be something that we could be looking at as a task force, but I would have to go back and look at last year's meeting schedule. I don't have that in front of me.
So, CJ, I think the next major announcement or event that will happen is obviously the signing of the budget. And almost immediately after that, in July, Raif and I hope I'm still here in July, but in July, we generally attend a school services workshop to provide highlights of what has been signed. And I think that might be a good report for this group, is to say, here is what May was, and here is what was signed. Are they significantly consistent or significantly different? And so I think that would be a good report to make sometime in July, or maybe early August.
Okay.
I guess I'm just wondering, because we always circle back to what's the purpose of the task force. So thank you so much, Raul, for the presentation. I'm just wondering, is there our goal is supposed to be providing input for the formation of the budget. And so then what happens now that we've received this? Do we have a purpose? So I'm just kind of left with that, but I know we're at time.
Thanks, Victoria. And perhaps that's where we can look at an additional meeting as we go through that process, and see what other input there may be here. And I certainly will reflect on that comment and maybe how we can plan it for the future to work a little bit differently. Any other feedback from the team before we prepare for our board budget subcommittee meeting? Don't worry, if you haven't had enough budget talk, you can tune in for that after a short break. Thank you, everybody, for being with us today and for the discussion. And we will see everybody soon.
All right, see you then.